Okay, it looks like we have a critical mass of attendees here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining part one of CluePoints ICHE 6 R2 Implementation, Value, and Data Quality webinar series. Today's hour session is going to be delivered by Steve Young, CluePoints Chief Operations Officer. As our operations officer, Steve is primarily responsible for ensuring successful client adoption of the CluePoints platform. Over his career, Steve has worked for 3 biopharmaceutical companies over a span of about 15 years, where he assumed leadership positions in clinical data management, as well as led successful adoption and enterprise rollup of EDC at both J&J as well as Centocor. He spent an additional 6 years with eClinical solutions providers, Medidata and Omnicom, leading development of analytics and risk-based quality management solutions, and really driving forward a lot of the clinical operation methodology and consulting for many organizations during his tenure at those eClinical organizations. Steve's also led a pivotal RBM-related analysis in collaboration with Transcelerate, and is currently leading RBQM best practice initiatives for several industry RBM consortiums. Just before I hand things over to Steve, I do want to make everyone aware that today's session is going to be run in listen-only mode. So if anyone has any questions, please alert us via the Q&A box within the GoToMeeting control panel. We are also going to be running a couple of polls. We're going to do 2 polls throughout this session. So please, we're going to present the results live, so please get involved with those polling questions as they come about. And with that, Steve, I think I can hand things over to you and we can go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction, Dan, and welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining this webinar series. As Dan said, this is part 1 of a 2-part webinar series. Part 2 will be next week at the same day and time. And in part 1 today, we're going to focus more on the what and the why of the ICHE 6 update and risk-based quality management. And next week, we're really going to get more into the how. So that's more about getting into real best practices for successful implementation and adoption of this new paradigm. So with that, let's indeed start with the why. What you're seeing here is part of the introduction to the actual ICHE 6 Revision 2 update. And I've highlighted a couple of sentences in particular here that I think are very telling and appropriate in terms of the background and what's the real motivation for this new move of the industry to RBQM and why ICH has made this very significant update to GCP guidelines. First, you can see that they're pointing out that really over the last 15 or 20 years, the size, duration, complexity, and of course then the cost of clinical research has increased very significantly. And that's really represents a growing crisis in the industry. Certainly the cost of clinical development alone has been very significant, but it's also put a lot of burden on the operational management and operational success of clinical trials, including quality. Over that same period of time, however, we've moved as an industry from what used to be a largely paper-based clinical trial management process and clinical data recording, paper case report forms, etc. And we've transitioned to an electronic internet-based approach to clinical trial management. And that's opened up a tremendous opportunity for us to consider taking a much more effective, efficient approach to trial planning and trial management. So it's really been a very timely development given the growing challenges that we've had in the industry. Looking in a little more detail about the challenges that are pointed out or alluded to in ICH, starting with study complexity and size. The Tufts Center for Drug Development has managed and published and updated a set of metrics and analysis of study complexity, where they've compared a large number of various complexity measures across a large number of studies initiated and run between 2001 and 2005 to a similar volume of studies in the following decade, 2011 to 2015. And there's really some startling results that came out of this, and I'll just point out a few of these. The average number of procedures that are being prescribed for each patient in a clinical trial has increased close to 70% over that decade. So patients are going through a lot more, as are the sites. The amount of data being generated and collected is close to 90% more than it was. So we're almost double the amount of data that has to be generated, processed, and managed in clinical research. And then there's been an actual doubling in the number of participating countries. So across all three of these, you can see that the management of clinical trials is not getting any easier. It's getting more costly. And in addition to higher costs, this increased complexity inevitably puts increased burden on operational outcomes and operational management. In other words, quality measures in clinical research. And indeed, we have real evidence of the impact of quality issues in clinical research. Back about 5 years ago, an analysis was published in the JAMA publication, and it was a very interesting analysis. It looked at all new molecular entity submissions to the FDA over a 10-year period, around the same time frame from about 2001 to 2011. And there was, if I'm recalling correctly, there was just over 300 such submissions during that time period. And exactly half of them failed first cycle review, so they were not approved for marketing on first cycle review. The article looked further at and documented all the reasons, the documented reasons for those first cycle review failures. And what it indicates is that there's very strong evidence that up to a third of those failures have quality related causes to them. So in other words, not failing for the reasons that we should be failing, that is because of lack of efficacy or lack of sufficient safety profile established for a drug, but because of operational issues, which I would call conceptually avoidable issues. That's really a pretty startling metric, that almost a third of our failures, or 1/6 of all submissions, are being either significantly delayed or permanently never approved for the wrong reason, because of quality related issues. So definitely reinforces the crisis from a quality perspective. Even, so for the 50% that failed, about half of them were eventually approved. But even the ones that were approved, the average delay in approval was about 14 months. So the business impacts to an organization are huge. So the stakes are extremely high in what we're talking about. On top of that, we're increasingly recognizing that our traditional approach to quality management and quality oversight in clinical research has not been very effective and has definitely not been very efficient. I was actually very closely involved in an analysis done with Transcelerate back in 2014. The results were published in a DIA journal in late 2014. And we were specifically trying to get a more quantitative assessment of the contribution of our traditional practice of 100% source data review and verification on data quality. And one of the top line results we found across, I believe it was close to 1,200 studies across many organizations and study phases, on average only about 1% of ECRF data is corrected as a result of the traditional practice of 100% SDV. And that comes at a huge cost. Most estimates are in the range of SDV contributing about 15% of the total cost of clinical operations. So we're getting a very modest return, if any, for a practice that's driving a very significant amount of the cost of clinical research. And so as the ICH committee and many in the industry have recognized, we really need a change in our approach. So back to ICH, the same introduction section goes on to explain that they are encouraging with this amended guideline an improved and more efficient approach to clinical trial design, conduct, oversight. So, you know, we do need to comply with the updated ICHGCP guideline, but it's not just about compliance, and we'll talk more about that. There's a huge opportunity that is in fact being encouraged and proposed, not just by ICH, but previously, as you may know, by the FDA and EMA with the guidance papers that they issued on risk-based monitoring and risk-based quality management. There are 3 sections in ICH that are particularly relevant to this topic. Section 5.0 on quality management, and in that they are now laying out really what is a step-by-step set of guidance for risk-based quality management to your clinical research and clinical trials. Section 5.2 has an added paragraph that reinforces the sponsor's responsibility for overseeing their research and the quality of their clinical trials in an outsourced relationship. And then Section 5.18 adds several paragraphs on the operational components of this paradigm, what many people refer to specifically as risk-based monitoring. There's been a lot of confusion over the last 5 or 6 years in the industry in terminology and in terms of an understanding of what do we mean, what's the scope of risk-based monitoring. I think more and more people in the industry are starting to recognize that, you know, and starting to use the term risk-based quality management to describe the full paradigm that we're moving into. And maybe risk-based monitoring should be focused more on that operational component of monitoring your sites and your trial operationally. And that's really covered in the, you know, more pertinent to the Section 5.18 on risk-based monitoring. So it's not just about risk-based monitoring in that context. It really is much broader than that, and it's about risk-based quality management in clinical research. You see here in this illustration the 7 steps that are laid out in ICH E6 Section 5 on risk-based quality management. So from left to right, it's you know, they're guiding on seven particular steps or parts of the process, and really the first 4 of those we can think of as being part of the risk planning component of the paradigm, which should be initiated well before the start of your study execution for each study. The last 4 really are more of the implementation of that and the operational component of essentially following your plan and doing a more efficient, effective approach to monitoring your clinical trials. We can think of those first 4 steps as really the think part, and then the final 4 as the act. And really, what, you know, all of these new guidelines and you know, what we're describing as risk-based quality management, in many ways, the purpose of it is conceptually extremely simple. It's really providing a framework for all of us and all of our study teams, and encouraging us to really think before we act in clinical research. For those of us that have been in clinical research for a while, we always, you know, we're very well aware of the scramble that happens in planning and trying to get a new trial started. There's a million things going on, and there's also a deadline. There's a target of July 1st, for instance, to get my first patient in. And people are running around and very often not really taking the time to think through what could be going wrong on their trial. Well, this new paradigm is presenting a great opportunity and a great set of guidance for helping us to slow down a little bit in planning and make sure that we are thinking through what can go wrong and actually planning to control those risks and to reduce those risks operationally. So let's talk a little bit more about the study risk assessment piece, the risk planning piece. There's actually four particular steps, including the planning for risk control, but it really starts with identification and confirming what are the most critical processes in my clinical trial versus those that are maybe just supportive, ancillary. And along with that, what's the most critical data? Using that, the study team can then use that to help guide them on thinking about and identifying what are the biggest operational risks in my trial. And then in identifying those risks, evaluating, assessing, what is the potential impact? What's the probability of these things happening? And then once that's all characterized, then determining what am I going to do about all of these key operational risks that I haven't already done to address them. Are there risks that I can reduce? How can I monitor for these risks operationally to detect if issues are happening as we were concerned about? It's also important to consider starting this process as early as possible so that you might have an impact actually on the protocol design itself. Are there things I can do to improve the protocol design to actually eliminate or reduce some of the risks that we're seeing? In terms of technology enablement, which is also a very important component, organizations now are along a spectrum. Some are still looking and maybe don't have any formal capability in place to support this risk planning process. Many are starting with a spreadsheet. Transcelerate has presented their standard racked template in a spreadsheet form, and we know that a lot of organizations are using that as a starting point. But that has a lot of shortcomings as well. Ideally, you're moving to a really well-defined, supported online risk assessment capability that allows you to fully document everything, to generate reports and feed downstream plans as well. So we're going to stop and we're going to do poll question 1 right now. So the question is, what tool set is your organization currently employing for risk study planning? So you can see the choices there. We'll take about 30 seconds to give everyone a chance to respond to that. Okay, I think we've probably had enough time, and let's take a look at what the results of that are. So very interesting. We see that about 2/3 of your organizations are using Excel spreadsheets for it, which makes sense. I think that's what I would have expected in terms of where we are in the adoption phase right now, because it's the easiest low-hanging fruit for teams to get started with, which makes sense. It's good to see that there are some 13% that have actually moved to a more mature approach and system that would provide audit trails, provide reporting, and be able to integrate and feed downstream systems as well. So thank you for responding to that. Very interesting results on that. Okay, so let's then talk about step number 4, risk control. And when we talk about risk control, so once you've identified and evaluated all your risks, as I said, your study team is then going to discuss and decide what additional actions or things they can put in place to reduce those risks, either reduce the impact, reduce the likelihood, etc. And that may take many different forms. It may mean, hey, we need to do some reinforcement training on this unique or complicated assessment at the site initiation visits, or a number of other things. But among those is also risk control in the sense of how am I going to monitor for those risks and effectively identify if we're having these risks emerging during our trial so that we can intervene and course correct as soon as possible. And that really gets us to the centralized monitoring recommendation, which is in section 5.18 of the ICH. And that paragraph on central monitoring really lays out fairly clearly an expectation that, yes, you should be using key risk indicators and quality tolerance limits, but should also be looking at using statistical methods to review all of the patient data coming in, to look for unusual patterns of data that might represent risks in the way the trial is being conducted and data generated across all your sites. We refer to KRIs and QTLs as a supervised component or supervised approach to risk monitoring. The idea there is that you design key risk indicators based on specific pre-identified risks. Same with quality tolerance limits. And you put those in place to monitor for those specific known risks, and therefore we call it supervised. Unsupervised is an approach of statistical data monitoring to run a number of advanced statistical tests across most or all of your patient data to expose and identify potential problems that you may not even have thought of in a pre-study risk assessment. And as we've seen across all of our clients using CluePoints, a very powerful component of identifying actual issues in your trial. So similarly, you know, there is a spectrum of maturity in terms of implementation. You know, some of you may not have a formal central monitoring capability in place yet. Some others may have a capability for this supervised approach, KRIs and QTLs. And that's understandable because a lot of the discussion up until recently in the industry has been a focus on KRIs and now more recently QTLs. But then a more comprehensive set would have both the supervised and the unsupervised, the broad statistical data monitoring approach. So we're going to stop actually and take poll question 2 on that particular point and ask the question to you: what best reflects the current scope of centralized monitoring capabilities used by your organization? And you can see there in the answers, you know, the second one is really the supervised approach, KRIs, QTLs, and data visualizations. The third option would be if you're only using the unsupervised approach, the broad statistical data monitoring. And then the fourth option would be that you're using both approaches, so more comprehensive. So I'll give about 20 or 30 seconds to allow you to answer that, and then we'll see what the results are. Okay, why don't we go ahead and take a look at the results. Poll question number 2. And again, very interesting answers here. So I would have expected that the largest percentage would be where it is, and that's using just KRIs, QTLs, data visualizations. But it is good and promising to see that a significant percentage of you are also using the statistical data methods. I see the 12% for only using statistical data monitoring and 21% using the most comprehensive, which is where I would suggest that you should be striving for ultimately. Certainly, as reinforced in ICH E6, their expectations are that you're incorporating all of these methods and certainly the statistical data monitoring component. So very interesting. Thank you very much for answering that. Okay. I also want to throw something out. This is actually just hot off the press, and it was just announced this morning that CluePoints and the FDA have an ongoing collaboration to explore a more data-driven approach to quality oversight in clinical trials. This is a collaboration that's been going on very actively and successfully over the past 2 years. And an extension was just announced today. So this collaboration is going to continue into the future. And really, what's at the core of it is the FDA's interest in applying these same methods, these statistical methods, both supervised and unsupervised, in identifying sites that would be most interesting for inspection during regulatory submissions. So a very successful collaboration that's continuing and really reinforces the FDA's commitment to what they're promoting, which is the use of this more efficient, effective approach to quality oversight and quality management. So the operational component of risk communication, risk review, and risk reporting in ICH is very much about managing that operational component. So we have the risk control, the implementation of your statistical methods and your KRIs and QTLs. Then you're going to have a team, your study team is going to be monitoring those, looking for and identifying potential emerging risks, deciding, investigating them to determine if they're actual issues, following up as necessary to implement corrective and preventive actions to address those risks and thereby improve the overall quality management of your clinical trial. And so what we should be thinking about, among other things, is how are we managing? How are we effectively managing that communication and reporting? And again, there's a spectrum of capabilities in place, from no formal capability yet to utilizing existing communication tools. But really where we want to be ultimately is to have technology-enabled capability that enables a very well integrated issue management capability around it. So you're going to have a lot of follow-ups, and you're also going to have a lot of rationale and document, that you need to document and ensure that you have full evidence of how your study teams followed up on risk during the trial. And that's really where you want to be striving to be ultimately when you're fully adopted. So let's talk now about outsourcing of research, which I'm sure most of you are doing at least some outsourcing of your clinical operations to CRO partners, or you're a CRO partner working with sponsors and supporting them. You can see the excerpt from the new paragraph in section 5.2 that really reinforces the sponsor's ultimate responsibility for the quality and integrity of the trial data. And so the question comes up, what about with respect to the implementation of risk-based quality management? How should the sponsor be involved, and at what level should the sponsor be involved versus the CRO? There's generally, as we say, that you can think of 3 different outsourcing models that you're probably somewhere across the spectrum. No real outsourcing, more or less fully sponsor managed clinical trials, fully outsourced, and then a hybrid model. You can think of functional outsourcing models where some of the trial functions are being outsourced to one or more CRO partners. So with respect to RBQM, what should you put in the hands of your CRO partner if you're a sponsor, and vice versa? If you're a CRO, what should your sponsor be involved in with respect to that? We can think conceptually of 3 different categories. Either as a sponsor, you can decide to own and manage all of this yourself, whether or not or regardless of what components that you're outsourcing of the trial to a CRO. You can be an active participant, but not necessarily own, be primarily responsible for making each of these happen. Or you can take a more passive role that we're referring to here as advise and review. If you look at it though, you know, there's, from my point of view, there's too much at stake as a sponsor for you to take too passive an approach to this. Risk-based quality management is really about planning for and ensuring the optimal quality outcomes on your clinical trial. And so you should have opportunity to get, you know, as involved as possible. And I would suggest that during the risk planning piece, the risk evaluation and risk planning, you should be able to do that without expending too much resource effort. It is, after all, your trial and it's your investigational product. You have experts that know the product and the trial and the development plan better than your CRO partners. And so in terms of guiding what are the key risks and how should we address them, of course you should have an active seat at the table if you're not running it. So maybe ideally it's a collaborative approach with your CRO partner. Same with risk control and the centralized monitoring component. Your stake in this is very large. The stake in getting it right or getting it wrong is very significant. So at least understanding and maybe even guiding or approving what are the risk controls being put in place. You know, and during the course of the trial, why not at least be an active participant in reviewing what the emerging risks are and being part of the conversation in terms of guiding what the follow-up should be and what are real issues, what are non-issues. So very important considerations from a sponsor perspective in that regard. Let's turn now to the functional impact of risk-based quality management and the responsibilities. In other words, what are the implications for your organization and for your various functional teams within the organization? One high-level observation that we should really understand is that risk-based quality management should not be considered to be owned by one or a couple of functions within your organization. I think if that's the message and the perception going out in your organization, it's going to be a recipe for some trouble down the line. Some people believe, well, that's just a site monitoring thing, and so the impact is just on site monitoring. We've seen a tendency for a lot of it to fall under data management, especially the central monitoring and the analytics that are a component of that. Certainly, some functions are going to be impacted more than others. But if you look at the pre-study risk assessment process, you definitely want to have full cross-functional team active participation in that process, because every functional representative is bringing a different perspective and a lot of expertise to that conversation. And so to really have a fully successful risk planning process, you need to have everyone engaged in that. You need to have full cross-functional participation. And the same goes during the course of the trial as you're identifying potential risks and deciding how to follow up on them appropriately. It doesn't belong to just one function or one group operationally. So that's first and foremost. As I said, there definitely are some functions impacted more than others, and there's definitely some decisions to be made about the impact on roles and potentially new roles as well. We're going to dive into more detail on that next week in part 2 of this webinar series. So we'll really get into more detail, among other things, about what you should be considering in terms of the roles to help drive a successful implementation of RBQM. Just as a teaser, we'll talk about in particular at least a role that we generically call a risk coordinator that you should really consider focusing or dedicating some resources to. And that role, at least conceptually, plays plays a critical part in both the pre-study risk planning as well as the operational centralized monitoring and risk triage process as well. And of course, we have to consider the skills and roles for central monitoring and what the impact is to site monitoring as well. So how do I know if I'm succeeding in implementing the recommendations in ICHG6 R2? There's a number of different areas that you can think about, but here's a few good questions that may imply ways that you should be objectively looking at and over time measuring the success or not of your implementation. As I said earlier, you should start the process as early as possible, and you should really be applying this risk-based approach during protocol development, if at all possible. So is your protocol being influenced by your risk assessment process? So something really strongly to consider. Documented risk assessment with critical data and processes. So are your study teams successfully engaged and doing effective risk assessments, identifying critical data and processes, and are they putting effective risk controls in place? And are those well defined and documented as well? And when we talk about risk controls, not just the KRIs again and QTLs and statistical data monitoring or the centralized monitoring component, but other components of risk control. And I'll point out in particular a targeted or reduced SDV plan. And when I say SDV here, think of SDR as well, source data review and source data verification. As we pointed out earlier, there's increasing recognition in the industry, and of course the regulators and ICH are encouraging us to rely relatively less on that old method of 100% review on site and complement it and rely more on centralized monitoring to help guide the on-site monitoring component. So where are you with that? I know that from talking to a number of different organizations, some are deciding to start out more conservatively on that front to help manage change, and that's okay. In other words, we're not going to reduce SDV by too much to start out, and we'll start reducing it over time. I think that's an okay decision. I always encourage teams to try to be forward-leaning in that regard. And yes, you have to manage change within the organization, and it is a mindset change. But the evidence is overwhelming that it's a costly and largely unnecessary process. Documented evidence of risk assessment and reevaluation. Are you reassessing risk during the course of the trial? So you shouldn't just be assessing risk during the trial. You should be revisiting that risk assessment, especially as you're learning about new risks emerging during the course of your trial. You should also reassess risk at certain junctures. For instance, if you have a protocol amendment, there should be a formal assessment of what new or changed risks there are as a result of this protocol amendment, as one example. So are your study teams doing that? Are you documenting the risk, what I call the risk triage process operationally? So you have centralized monitoring, you have regular risk reviews to see what's going on. And as risks are coming up, you should be thinking through, investigating, determining what follow-up actions are needed. And are you fully documenting that? So you have a story at the end of your trial to tell, that you can say what you encountered and how you addressed that. As we indicated earlier, there are significant opportunities for efficiencies with this new paradigm. So it's really an amazing and unique opportunity that I can't remember anything similar to this in the past, where the regulators and ICH are strongly encouraging and setting expectations for an approach not just to drive higher quality outcomes, but allowing us to do it more efficiently as well. So it's really a huge opportunity. These are just a handful of of some samples of where we might be able to drive greater efficiency. Reducing protocol complexity by really taking a hard look at the protocol, looking at risks and trying to reduce the burden and complexity in our protocol design, focusing on what matters. So really tailoring and focusing our operational quality management processes on the critical data and processes and those key risks that we've identified. I already talked about replacing legacy controls like SDV or relying on it much less, taking a more adaptive and targeted approach to site monitoring and site visits, supported by and guided, at least in part, by the centralized monitoring activities. And also recognition that risk management in general is about fixing root cause problems, not just correcting data. So in an apt medical example, it's really getting at treating the root cause disease or the quality, what is the root of quality issues that we're having, and not just band-aiding a data cleaning process through correcting data transcriptions, as an example. It means greater cross-functional collaboration, which should yield fantastic benefits. And then we should be doing it in a way that we're consolidating all relevant documentation into a single source and using what we've learned about risks and issues on our trial and applying those to future studies. In terms of efficiency, one of the biggest areas that we recognize for efficiency is indeed the site monitoring. And many estimates converge on up to 30% of the cost of clinical operations being driven by site monitoring. About half of that, by many or most estimates, about half of that workload and cost is driven by this traditional practice of 100% SDV, SDR, which means, as I mentioned earlier, 15% of the total study cost is driven by this traditional SDV process. So there's a significant opportunity for efficiency there. In this hypothetical example, consider removing 80% of the SDV workload. And that's just not even including where you might take a targeted approach to other on-site monitoring activities as well. But if you just look at that, an 80% reduction in that, which many organizations are already at that level or fast approaching it, that implies conceptually a 40% reduction in site monitoring workload, which is up to a 12% reduction in direct savings of the total study cost. And this isn't just conceptual. Some organizations are already realizing it. And in fact, one of our enterprise clients, Pfizer, presented at a conference last year this slide and a couple of others explaining how they are recognizing quantitatively direct savings with their risk-based monitoring and risk-based quality management approach. And as you can see in this was an example as they presented from an actual trial. I believe it wasn't even a large phase 3. It was I believe a phase 2 trial. And they outsourced the monitoring. They asked for 2 bids from their CROs for each trial, one based on a traditional monitoring approach with regular visits and 100% SDV, and then one with a set of assumptions based on a risk-based monitoring approach with a reduction in SDV and accordingly on-site visits. And so they compare the 2 bids, and they've been obviously implementing successfully risk-based monitoring, and so the direct net savings is represented here on this trial is about $2.7 million. So not insignificant at all. And as you can see in the notes, the number of monitoring visits was decreased by about 50% for this particular sample trial. And of course they did, what's also included in these numbers is an assumption of increasing the number of remote site contacts or remote site visits to fill in the gaps between the on-site visits to the site. So very compelling real evidence of the savings that can be achieved with this paradigm. We at CluePoints have actually developed a fairly sophisticated, what we call a value model or an ROI model for RBQM, and we measure it across 3 different dimensions. timelines, quality, and efficiency, specifically around site monitoring, and showing you the example to kind of compare it to the Pfizer example that we just showed. So you can see on the left-hand side, you input a number of assumptions and study parameters into the model, and it'll actually calculate the projected savings based on the set of assumptions that you can achieve. You can see on the right for the sample trial, it's a trial, might be a phase 2 or small phase 3 trial, 50 sites, 550 patients, a 26-month total duration trial. And you can see here again the original site monitoring cost based on a traditional approach, the revised total site monitoring cost based on a targeted SDV SDR, and the assumption that was input into the model for this one was an 80% reduction. And so you can see the total direct savings, again, in a similar range of well over $2 million for this sample trial. We've also been very conservative in our model and making sure that we're covering all of the incremental costs as well, and particularly here, the central monitoring cost. And what we've modeled is the cost of both the technology and the resource effort to fully conduct and carry out centralized risk monitoring on your trial. Even so, the net savings is very significant, and again, this is using a very conservative approach. So just to wrap up and conclude for this one, ICHE6 is definitely about quality, and it's not just about risk-based monitoring as we discussed. It's really the end-to-end process for more effectively and efficiently planning for and managing quality and improving quality outcomes on your clinical research. And compliance is a very good motivator for all of us, but it's really not just about compliance. In fact, it's a huge opportunity. A huge opportunity to drive much better quality outcomes in clinical research, and amazingly to do it more efficiently, more resource and cost efficiently. We'll talk more, get in more detail next week about the other dimensions, about the opportunity to improve timelines and the opportunity, the business outcomes of improved quality in terms of time to market and marketing success rates, related to that example I showed you earlier from the JAMA article. When you're outsourcing, and most of you are, engage your CRO partners. There's just too much at stake to ignore it or hand it over completely. And it's your responsibility, as ICH is pointing out. And for those of you that feel that you may not have a lot of bandwidth to do too much of the trial activities yourself, you should be able to engage in the risk planning and even the central monitoring and risk review during the trial without the need to expend a lot of resource. And the importance of it can't be understated. So it's a unique opportunity to comply, to improve quality, and to be more efficient. So with that, that's all I had. And we do have at least 8 minutes for questions. So Dan, do we have any questions from the audience that we can review?
We do, Steve, and thank you everyone for participating in the polls, as well as all the questions that we have here in the queue. We have a number of them. We will try to get to a couple of them over the next 8 minutes or so, and we can surely follow up with folks if we haven't gotten to your specific question. So I guess, Steve, to kind of kick things off, can you give an example of an operational issue that's been detected by the unsupervised techniques that you referred to in the presentation?
Oh yeah, sure. We have a lot of them that we've built up over the last 4 or 5 years at CluePoints across all of our customers. One that comes to mind, mainly because it was very recent, was this one was a significant one. There was some intentional, it looks like intentional misconduct that was happening. This was on a dermatology trial. phase 3, and it was global in nature. And it was actually a combination of unsupervised, meaning the broad statistical data monitoring, that revealed a lot of very unusual data patterns at this site. But we also, our CluePoints analyst study team, proposed and implemented some well-designed key risk indicators on specifically the key endpoint assessments being done in the trial. And on a dermatology trial, the key endpoints, there was 2 or 3 different assessments that were all contributing to the primary endpoint, and they were investigator-led assessments. What we were seeing from the unsupervised approach was a significant lack of variability within and across patients on these assessment scores. So statistically, it was very unusual at this site compared to other sites, and it was a low variability. So those were 2 different measures. Also, the mean value was in a different range. So the average scores across all the patients were in a statistically different range than we were seeing at other sites. And then we designed some KRIs. What was interesting in this trial is that there was tablet devices used for direct capture of the dermatology assessments for the primary endpoints. And that presented a great opportunity because, being direct capture, we also had audit trail information. So we designed, as an example, one of the KRIs that we put in place was to look at the average duration from start to finish of each assessment in the audit trail. And at most of the sites across the trial, the average assessment was taking from 13 to 15 minutes, but at this site it was taking 3 to 4 or 5 minutes. So again, statistically way out of range, and a big red flag. And there was, yeah. So I mean, that is a really good example. I mean, that's one where it became very clear. What was also interesting in that example, by the way, is that, and we find this very often with central monitoring and the unsupervised approach, is that the site management team and the study team was not at all aware of these issues. Even from the site monitors having gone to multiple visits at this site, was completely unaware of these issues. So it really reinforces, again, the power of this unsupervised approach in monitoring.
Excellent. No, I agree with you, Steve. I think it's a great example to cover that particular question. So another one in here that I see that I think will be of interest to a lot of the folks on the line here. You had mentioned the FDA agreement. Are the FDA actually using this on real submissions to select sites for inspection?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. That's definitely been their intent from the beginning. We understand that they are using it for that. We don't know exactly how many trials or which trials. This is a unique situation where CluePoints is being installed on site at FDA, so we don't get access directly to the studies and the data that they're analyzing, but they are doing it. In fact, this was brought up at there was an FDA workshop back in July that Duke ran, and the FDA brought this up specifically at that workshop, and it was discussed that this is something that they're very committed to and very intending on using these approaches, in their process of quality oversight and as I said before, in terms of selecting sites for inspection. So yes, they are definitely using it.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Stephen. I think, in the interest of time, maybe let's see if we can cover one more, and then we can follow with the folks for all the other ones. So another one in here, and I think you covered a little bit of this during the presentation, but just to answer this one directly, can you elaborate on whether the ICHG6 revision is meant to replace 100% or SDV, or is it more so meant to augment 100% source data verification?
Well, I think the intent is that, well, it's definitely encouraging less reliance on on-site SDV. It's not prescribing a significant, a specific amount of reduction, but it's really calling for the implementation of centralized monitoring techniques, statistical data monitoring, in part to complement, on-site source data verification, but definitely also encouraging that the on-site monitoring in general and any SDV should be more guided by the centralized monitoring component. So there are a lot of conversations about, how much SDV is the appropriate amount. I would say that there's no exact right answer to that, but I think more and more of the industry is coming to the same conclusions that I'm agreeing with, which is we've been using SDV incorrectly. We've been treating it as a hammer to try to drive quality, and it doesn't work that way. I'm one who believes that some modest amount of SDV and SDR is still definitely has value, but it should be done in a modest, targeted approach, only to help confirm or reconfirm, as one of the tools to help reconfirm that the site appears to be understanding the protocol and following good practice on site.
Excellent. No, and thank you for that, Steve. And with that, we've reached the top of the hour here. So I'd like to thank everyone for dialing in today, and for all the poll question responses, as well as the questions in the Q&A boxes. We haven't gotten all of them, so we will follow up with folks that we did not get to. Also, just to note, we did record the session, so we will send everyone out a link of the recording. There were also a couple of questions about potentially sharing some of the slides, so we can surely get those over to the individuals that have requested those as well. So with that, Steve, thank you so much for driving the discussion today, and thank you everybody for the involvement.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Thanks everyone for listening today. We'll talk to you next week.
Excellent. Cheers.